It was a Tuesday, another night shift at the newspaper. The smell of stale coffee and printer ink hung heavy in the air. The clack, clack, clack of keyboards was our symphony. I was chasing a deadline, another story about another corrupt politician. I glanced at the clock, 2:37 a.m., almost quitting time. I lit another cigarette. The cherry glowed red in the darkness. Outside, the city was a labyrinth of shadows and neon, a typical night. Then everything changed. A blinding flash cut through the night sky. It wasn't lightning, too bright, too sudden. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding. My colleagues, startled, gathered behind me. We watched in stunned silence. A fiery streak blazed across the sky, leaving a trail of smoke and fire. It wasn't a shooting star, it was something much, much worse. This wasn't some harmless meteor shower. This was different. This was personal. The fiery object, trailing smoke and flames, slammed into the heart of the city. The impact shook the building, rattled our bones. We stared speechless at the plume of smoke and debris rising from the distance. The city, once a symphony of noise, went eerily silent. No car horns, no sirens, just an unsettling, heavy quiet. Then the screams started, faint at first, carried on the wind, then louder, closer, filled with terror. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The air crackled with an unfamiliar energy, raising goosebumps on my skin. My gut churned with a primal fear, something ancient and instinctive. We all felt it. Something was coming. Whatever had fallen from the sky, it wasn't going to be good. The newsroom phone started ringing, then all the phones started ringing. Chaos erupted, reporters scrambling, photographers grabbing their gear. This wasn't just another story, this was the big one. I grabbed my coat and fedora, a sense of dread washing over me. Tonight, we weren't just reporting the news. Tonight, we were witnessing the end of the world. As I stepped out into the night, the screams echoing in my ears, I knew one thing for sure: this was going to be a long night. Whatever fell from the sky, whatever emerged from that crash site, it was going to change everything. And I, for one, was about to get a front row seat to the apocalypse. The city streets, usually a cacophony of noise and movement, were deserted. An unsettling quiet hung in the air, broken only by the distant wail of sirens. I walked, my footsteps echoing off the buildings. The air felt charged with an unnatural energy. Fear clung to the night like a shroud. As I got closer to the crash site, the smell hit me. Acrid smoke, burning metal, and something foul. It made my stomach churn. The smoke was thicker now, obscuring the sky. I pulled my fedora lower, trying to filter the air. The screams were closer now, desperate cries tearing through the silence. Each one sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I pressed on. I had a job to do, a story to tell, even if it killed me. The smoke began to clear, revealing the devastation ahead. What had once been a bustling city block was now a smoldering crater. Buildings lay in ruins, reduced to rubble and twisted metal. Cars were overturned, crushed like toys. And in the center of it all, something moved. I stopped at the edge of the crater, my breath catching in my throat. Heat radiated from the chasm, stinging my skin. The air crackled with strange energy. I peered into the depths, my heart pounding. The crater floor was utter devastation, like Dante's Inferno. Twisted metal glowed red-hot, smoke billowed, obscuring vision. But it wasn't the destruction, it was the things moving within it, emerging from the wreckage. Creatures from nightmares, massive, towering beings, sickly green, glistening flesh, crawling out of the pit, ancient and evil. This was something far worse, something that had no place on this earth. The creatures were grotesque, an unholy mockery of life. They were a nightmarish tapestry of chitinous armor, writhing tentacles, and gaping maws filled with rows of needle-like teeth. Their eyes, black pits devoid of emotion, reflected the flames like miniature infernos. They moved with disturbing fluidity, limbs contorting at unnatural angles. One larger creature let out a deafening roar. The sound vibrated deep within my chest, promising pain and suffering. The sight and sound sent a primal fear surging through me. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. I was a journalist, witnessing the end of everything. They were like something out of a Lovecraft story, claiming our world. Their bodies pulsed with a sickly green glow, a light that heralded the end of all things. One of the creatures, a hulking monstrosity with long, barbed tentacles, snatched a fleeing figure from the street. The scream was cut short as the creature brought the victim to its mouth, a horrifying maw that opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. I could hear the sickening crunch of bone, the wet tear of flesh, as the creature devoured its prey. Blood splattered across the pavement, a gruesome testament to the horror that was unfolding before my very eyes. The other creatures, drawn by the scent of blood, descended upon the city like a plague of locusts. They moved with terrifying speed, their massive limbs crushing cars and sending debris flying. The screams of the dying filled the air, a symphony of terror that echoed through the empty streets. I watched, my stomach churning as the creatures tore through the city, their hunger insatiable, their thirst for blood unquenchable. This wasn't an invasion, it was a feeding frenzy. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, frozen in place by the sheer horror of it all, the screams, the carnage, the otherworldly creatures feasting on the flesh of the innocent. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare, but even nightmares had to end eventually. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky a sickly grey, I knew I had to move. I had a story to tell, a warning to deliver. The world needed to know what had happened here, needed to see the face of the enemy. Turning away from the carnage, I forced myself to walk, each step heavy with the weight of what I had witnessed. The screams followed me, echoing in my ears long after I had left the city limits behind. I didn't know what the future held, what horrors these creatures would unleash upon the world, but one thing was certain. The world would never be the same. The sky had fallen, and from its wreckage, hell itself had crawled forth. And I was one of the few who had lived to tell the tale. The city, once our playground, was now a hunting ground. The creatures, those things from beyond the stars, were everywhere. They moved with terrifying speed and agility, their massive forms navigating the concrete jungle with ease. Buildings crumbled under their weight, cars were tossed aside like toys. I saw a woman, her face contorted in terror, running down the street, her child clutched in her arms. One of the creatures, a hulking behemoth with razor-sharp claws, snatched her from behind, lifting her high into the air. Her screams were cut short as the creature brought her to its gaping maw, the sound of crunching bones echoing through the empty streets. The child, miraculously unharmed, lay screaming in the street, its cries lost in the cacophony of destruction. I couldn't look away. I couldn't close my ears to the screams. This was our reality now. A living nightmare from which there was no escape. The air was thick with the stench of death, a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. It was the smell of blood, of viscera, of humanity being ripped apart, devoured by these monstrous invaders. They were no longer confined to the crash site. They had spread throughout the city, their numbers seemingly endless. They moved like wolves, hunting in packs, their grotesque forms silhouetted against the burning buildings. I saw one creature, smaller than the others, darting through the shadows. It was fast, almost too quick for the eye to see. It leaped onto a parked car, its claws digging into the metal. It turned its head, and for a moment our eyes met. It wasn't an animalistic gaze filled with hunger or rage. It was something colder, something more calculating. It was intelligence, and in that moment I knew. They weren't just mindless beasts driven by instinct. They were something far more terrifying. They were organized, they were strategic, they were here to conquer. The streets ran red with blood, a macabre river flowing through the concrete canyons. Body parts, dismembered and mangled, lay scattered amongst the debris, a gruesome testament to the creature's brutality. I saw a man, his face pale and drawn, impaled on a piece of twisted metal, his eyes staring vacantly at the sky. His chest rose and fell in ragged gasps, each breath a testament to his will to live. One of the creatures, its body slick with blood, approached him. It leaned down, its grotesque face inches from the dying man's. I couldn't hear what it was saying, but I could see the terror in the man's eyes, the desperate plea for mercy that died on his lips. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It lunged forward, and the man's screams were cut short. I turned away, unable to stomach the sight any longer, but the image seared into my mind refused to fade. This was no longer a city. It was an abattoir, and we were the cattle.
Sir, no, sir!
The military arrived, a last-ditch effort to reclaim our city, our lives. Tanks rumbled down the streets, their cannons firing into the horde of creatures. But it wasn't enough. The creatures were too fast, too strong. Their chitinous armor deflected bullets, and their regenerative abilities were unlike anything we had ever seen. Limbs severed by gunfire grew back within seconds, stronger, more grotesque than before. They were evolving, adapting to our weapons, our defenses, becoming more deadly with every kill. I watched as a tank, its barrel glowing red-hot, fired shell after shell into a massive creature. The creature roared in pain, its flesh sizzling and burning. But it didn't fall. It didn't even slow down. It charged the tank, its claws tearing through the armored plating as if it were paper. The tank exploded in a ball of fire, the screams of its crew lost in the inferno. Everywhere I looked, there was death and destruction. The city was drowning in blood, the air thick with the stench of decay. The survivors, those who were left, huddled in the shadows, their faces etched with fear and despair. But even in the darkest of times, hope finds a way. I saw acts of courage, of selflessness that reminded me of the best of humanity. Strangers helping strangers, sharing what little food and water they had left. A young couple, their faces streaked with grime, shielding their child from the horrors unfolding around them. A group of soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, fighting with a ferocity born of desperation, determined to sell their lives dearly. These flickers of light, these sparks of humanity, were all that stood between us and utter despair. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the ruined city, I knew one thing for sure. We were fighting a losing battle, but we would fight nonetheless. We would fight for our lives, for our loved ones, for the future of our species. We would fight because that's what humans do. We endure, we persevere, we hope. The ground shook with the rumble of approaching armor. Tanks, their turrets swiveling like predators scenting prey, rolled through the shattered streets. Soldiers, their faces grim masks of determination, fanned out, their weapons spitting fire into the advancing horde. A glimmer of hope, faint but persistent, flickered within me. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare would end. Maybe we could beat them back, drive them back into whatever hell they'd crawled from. But deep down, a chilling certainty settled in my gut. This wasn't a war we could win. This was an extermination. The whispers of annihilation hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. The creatures, those grotesque parodies of life, seemed to relish the challenge. They surged forward, their numbers undiminished, their hunger insatiable. The stench of blood and viscera, thick and cloying, intensified. A gruesome testament to the carnage that continued to unfold around me. The air roared with the deafening thunder of tank shells. Buildings already on the verge of collapse crumbled into dust under the onslaught. For a fleeting moment the creatures faltered, their advance momentarily checked by the sheer ferocity of the assault. I watched, a silent observer amidst the chaos, as a monstrous creature, its flesh riddled with bullet holes, staggered back, its grotesque form silhouetted against the inferno raging behind it. But the victory was short-lived. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to split the heavens, and charged headlong into the hail of bullets. To my horror, the bullets seemed to have little effect. They ripped through its flesh, leaving gaping wounds, but the creature just kept coming, its momentum unstoppable. It slammed into the lead tank, its massive claws tearing through the armored plating as if it were paper. The tank crumpled like a discarded toy, the screams of its crew cut short by the deafening explosion that followed. Panic rippled through the ranks of the soldiers. They fought bravely, desperately, but it was becoming increasingly clear that they were outmatched. Their weapons, designed for earthly conflicts, were proving woefully inadequate against these creatures from beyond the stars. And then, the unthinkable happened. As I watched, my blood turning to ice in my veins, the creatures began to change. Wounds that moments ago had been gaping rents in their flesh closed up, knitting together at an alarming rate. Their chitinous armor, already impervious to most small arms fire, thickened, becoming studded with bony protrusions. It was as if they were feeding on the chaos, on the death and destruction they were causing, evolving before our very eyes into something even more monstrous, even more deadly. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a battle we could win. This was an extinction event, and we, the human race, were on the menu. The retreat, when it came, was chaotic and desperate. Soldiers, many wounded, some dragging their fallen comrades, fell back under the relentless onslaught of the creatures. The streets, once arteries of life, were now choked with the debris of a lost civilization. I ran with the crowd, my heart pounding against my ribs, the screams of the dying echoing in my ears. The air was thick with the stench of fear and despair, a suffocating blanket that threatened to smother what little hope I had left. As I fled, I cast one last look back at the city. The creatures, their forms silhouetted against the inferno, had gathered at the edge of the crater. They stood there watching us, their silence more terrifying than any roar. And then, as one, they began to feed, their grotesque mouths working furiously as they devoured the dead and dying. The city, our city, was no longer a place of concrete and steel. It was their maw, a gaping abyss into which all hope had vanished. I kept running, didn't look back, couldn't bear to see another soul devoured. The city, once our sanctuary, had become a slaughterhouse. The stench of death clung to me, a fetid perfume announcing the end of days. The taste of copper filled my mouth, the metallic tang of blood, my own or someone else's, I couldn't tell. My lungs burned, each breath a shallow gasp. Muscles screamed for rest, but stopping even for a second felt like surrender. The streets, once teeming with life, were now rivers of blood and bone. I splashed through the gruesome current, my shoes slick with gore. Each step was treacherous, the ground littered with the remnants of lives cut short. A child's doll, its porcelain face staring vacantly at the sky, lay abandoned in a pool of crimson. A businessman's briefcase, its contents scattered and soaked in blood, lay open like a morbid treasure chest. I stumbled, my foot catching on something soft and yielding. It was a human hand severed at the wrist, its fingers curled into a final, desperate grasp. I retched, bile rising in my throat, but there was nothing left to throw up. The screams followed me, a chorus of agony echoing through the shattered cityscape. Each one was a nail hammered into the coffin of hope. I ducked into an alleyway, seeking a moment's respite from the carnage. The air here was thick with the stench of decay, the ground littered with refuse. Rats fattened on death scurried for cover as I passed. Above, the sky was a swirling canvas of smoke and ash, the sun a pale, sickly orb struggling to penetrate the darkness. The familiar cityscape had been transformed into a grotesque parody of itself. Buildings reduced to skeletal husks, streets choked with rubble and the dead. Through a broken window I glimpsed a flicker of movement. A woman, her face streaked with tears and grime, clutched a small child in her arms. She was singing softly, a lullaby from a forgotten world, her voice a frail shield against the horrors that surrounded them. I wanted to call out to her, to offer a word of comfort, but I knew it was futile. We were all living on borrowed time. The realization struck me like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a harvest. These creatures, these things from beyond the stars, hadn't come to conquer us in the traditional sense. They weren't interested in our land, our resources, or our technology. They were here for something far more primal, far more terrifying. They were here for us, our flesh, our blood, our very essence. It was all fuel for their insatiable hunger. We were nothing more than livestock to them, cattle to be herded, slaughtered, and consumed. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a primal fear that transcended even the horrors I had witnessed. I remembered the look in the creature's eyes, the cold, calculating intelligence that had stared back at me from the wreckage of our world. It wasn't hatred or rage that I had seen in those depths. It was something far worse. It was indifference. I emerged from the alleyway, my senses reeling, my mind struggling to process the sheer scale of the devastation. The streets were deserted now, the survivors either dead or in hiding. Even the creatures seemed to have vanished, retreating back into the shadows to digest their gruesome feast. I walked on, my footsteps echoing hollowly in the silence. The weight of what I had witnessed pressed down on me, threatening to crush me beneath its immensity. There was nowhere left to run, no escape from this new reality. The sky had fallen and we were alone. The city, once a symbol of human achievement, now stood as a testament to our fragility. It was a graveyard of shattered dreams, a monument to our hubris. And I, the lone witness to its fall, was left to carry the burden of its memory. The silence was the worst part. More terrifying than the screams, more unsettling than the crunching of bones. It stretched on, a suffocating blanket over the city, broken only by the crackle of flames and the sigh of the wind whistling through shattered windows. It was the silence of the grave, a chilling testament to the thoroughness of their work. The city, once a symphony of noise, was now a mausoleum. I wandered through the desolate streets, my footsteps echoing off the buildings, each one a stark reminder of the life that once pulsed through these veins of concrete and steel. I passed overturned cars, their metal carcasses twisted and torn, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the carnage. Newspapers, their headlines screaming of events now rendered meaningless, fluttered in the wind like fallen leaves. The city was a graveyard, but the bodies weren't buried. They lay where they fell, contorted in their final moments of agony, their eyes staring vacantly at the indifferent sky. I saw a businessman still clutching his briefcase, his face frozen in a rictus of terror. A young couple, their arms intertwined, their bodies partially devoured, their love story forever unfinished. A lone shopping cart lay on its side, its contents scattered, a poignant reminder of the mundane lives that had been extinguished. I wasn't alone, not entirely. Rats, fattened on the feast, scurried through the debris, their beady eyes watching me with unsettling intelligence. Flies buzzed lazily in the heat, drawn to the sweet, sickly smell of decay that permeated the air. Even the scavengers seemed subdued, as if the sheer scale of the carnage had stunned them into silence. In the days before the sky fell, we had thought ourselves invincible, masters of our domain. Our arrogance, it seemed, had known no bounds. We built towers that scraped the sky, machines that could think, weapons that could obliterate entire cities, and yet all our ingenuity, all our technological prowess counted for nothing against the raw, primal hunger of these creatures. We had mistaken comfort for safety, progress for invulnerability. We had forgotten that nature, in its most brutal and unforgiving form, always bats last. The creatures, I realized, hadn't come to conquer us in the traditional sense. They weren't interested in our territory, our resources, or our technology. They hadn't come to enslave us, to subjugate us, to bend us to their will. They had come for something far simpler, far more primal. They had come to feed. We were nothing more to them than cattle, a herd to be culled, our planet nothing more than a vast feeding ground. This wasn't an invasion, it was a harvest. The thought chilled me to my core, a terrifying truth that settled deep in my gut, a leaden weight of despair. The world as we knew it was gone, replaced by a horrifying new reality where survival was measured in moments, not years. But even in the face of such overwhelming darkness, a flicker of defiance sparked within me. I was alive. I had witnessed the unthinkable, and I would bear witness until the very end. I would tell their story. I would make sure the world that was, knew what happened here. I would be the voice of the fallen, the chronicler of our demise. I pulled my fedora low over my eyes, a shield against the horrors that surrounded me, and lit a cigarette, the cherry glowing red in the gathering darkness. The smoke, acrid and bitter, filled my lungs, a small comfort in a world gone mad. I had a story to tell. The last story, the story of how the sky fell, and how the earth, hungry for our demise, devoured us whole. I took a drag from my cigarette, the ember glowing like a malevolent eye in the darkness, and started walking. Towards the rising sun, towards the unknown, towards whatever fate awaited me in this new, terrifying world.